Henry L. Gaines stepped onto the polished marble sidewalk of Rockridge Bank just after sunrise, his cane tapping a gentle rhythm against its surface. At 79, his lean frame carried decades of determined dignity, each step measured, purposeful, born of a lifetime navigating streets both welcoming and hostile. The morning light skated across his silver hair, illuminating deep-set lines in his face, lines born of grief, perseverance, and memories his heart could never forget. He paused to straighten the lapel of his faded navy blazer, surveying the sleek glass facade that towered above him. To passers-by, he might seem a harmless old man, but to those who held power in this city, his presence at that entrance would be anything but insignificant. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Inside, the bank lobby brimmed with early customers, suits and smartphones. Ambitions murmured in hushed tones to the soft click of targeted deals. Polished desks and quiet conversations filled the air, and a ticker tape displayed stock prices in cold neon. Everything had a sleek uniformity, yet beneath the calm surface, Henry sensed an undercurrent of unspoken rules that applied one way to the polished patrons, and another to him. He drew a slow breath, cane in one hand, leather briefcase in the other, and started up the 3 stone steps that led to the automatic glass doors. His heart thudded with nerves, surprising at his age, but old fears never fully dissolve. Just as the soft chime of the doors welcomed him, the guard, a young white man in a crisp uniform, stepped forward. His posture was authoritative, tone sharp. "Sir, I need to see some ID before you come in," he said, not loud enough to disrupt the lobby's rhythm, but clear enough to slice through Henry's breath. Henry exhaled and lowered the brim of his fedora. "I'm headed to the manager's office," he said, voice steady though quivering at the edges. "I have an appointment." The guard's eyes flickered, assessing, suspicious, before he leaned in. "Sir, policies are policies, no exceptions." Around them, bank clients glanced briefly, some with curiosity, most with indifference. A middle-aged woman in designer clothes paused as she tapped her card, shot a hesitant glance at Henry, then returned her focus to the teller. No one offered help. No one spoke up. The guard's firm face betrayed no empathy, only a thinly veiled assertion of control. Henry's frustration grew, a pressure cooker of emotion that simmered beneath his polite exterior. He raised his cane slightly, an unconscious gesture of dignity and defiance. He waited, Cartier watch ticking beneath his shirt cuff, each second amplifying an invisible distance between him and those braying for access beyond the door. He could almost feel the weight of centuries, the scars of segregated entrances, Jim Crow signs looming like phantoms bearing down on him. His gaze dropped to the ornate gold lettering that spelled out Rockridge Bank. The word Rockridge felt like an insult, as though the building's grandeur demanded purity Henry wasn't allowed to provide. He adjusted his briefcase strap and cleared his throat, ready to demand his right as a fully scheduled guest, as the son of civil rights pioneers. The guard's jaw clenched. "Sir, if you don't have ID, I'm going to ask you to wait outside until management sorts this." He sounded rehearsed, impenetrable, as if authorized to block not just entry, but dignity. The lobby quiet shifted, footsteps slowed, small talk stilled. The guard's request had transformed the scene. Henry felt the social atmosphere retracting around him, creating an invisible barrier that communicated one simple message: you do not belong here. Inside, no staff member stepped forward. The tellers glanced at each other, awkward smiles playing on their lips. Their silence was a soft but lethal weapon. One receptionist in a white blouse backed away from the glass foyer. A young intern with a clipboard pretended to examine a schedule, then lowered his eyes. The lobby's glass walls reflected a community's conscious choice. Fearful of speaking up, they remained complicit. Henry felt the sting of their inaction more sharply than the guard's words. This wasn't about rules. It was about shape, color, and history. He sighed, the air leaving his lungs with a weight that lifted momentarily before it settled as guilt. He reached into his blazer for his wallet, hands trembling. Photo ID. He should have thought ahead, but memory warped his expectation. He'd thought his age and the formal appointment letter would suffice. The guard waited, not impatiently, but with unyielding resolve. He drew out the wallet and placed it on the granite step. ID card slid onto the step beside his briefcase. The guard leaned forward to inspect it, then leaned back, unreadable. Finally, he said, "This says you're from New Orleans. Your appointment letter says Atlanta. Who scheduled you?" The implication was clear. This man was not one of them. Henry's jaw clenched. "Mr. Simmons," he said, "head of branch operations." He sounded firm, like a lawyer presenting evidence. The guard hesitated, scanning the photo ID. The same skin, same face, but the colorless space between that man and the polished crowd made the guard uneasy. For a long moment, time rigid and slow, everything balanced on that guarded gaze. Then the guard said, "I'm going to verify that." Wait right there. He stepped back, phone to ear. Henry stood still. Inside, the lobby resumed its rhythm, muted, indifferent. The guard's decision lowered a veil, not just denial of entry, but denial of belonging. Inside the doors, worlds thrived that were not meant for Henry. Outside he stood, a living challenge to that division. A breeze drifted through the open door, brushing Henry's coat. He lowered his head, pain flickering behind his eyes. What else had he endured this morning, this month, this lifetime? A man once imprisoned for peaceful protest. A man who'd marched with Dr. King, whose hands had built schools and opened businesses in black neighborhoods, now waiting outside a bank in the city he'd helped shape. His throat tightened, his cane's tip shifted on the step. A morning of triumph had turned to old wounds. He closed his eyes briefly, blinking back memories of childhood days in Jim Crow, Alabama, of his mother being spat upon for walking into a white store, of early mornings before sunrise in segregated buses. The sting never faded. Each wound had become scar tissue, beautiful in its resilience, but still a wound. And as he opened his eyes, he saw faces reflected in the glass. Sympathetic, judgmental, ashamed. Their silence wounded him deeper than any guard's words. Then he felt himself stepping backward, pride folding into sorrow, as the guard blocked his path. The quiet throb of humiliation gnawed at him. He bent, lifting his briefcase, cane in hand. He took exactly one step away from the door. A single heartbeat later, he paused, caught between dignity and defeat. He should walk away, but something held him fast, something he couldn't name. And then the world paused. A voice, crisp and commanding, cut through the tension like a knife through glass. It carried gravity, familiarity, and shock. It belonged to someone important, someone who refused to be ignored. As Henry lifted his gaze ready to retreat, a strong silhouette filled the doorway behind the guard, and a single name dropped into the silence, delivering more shock than any slap could. Father. The word hung in the air like smoke after a sudden fire. Father. It wasn't whispered. It wasn't muttered in confusion, or buried beneath layers of professionalism. It was said with finality, with something raw in its tone. And it came from a man who, until that moment, had never raised his voice in public. Not in boardrooms, not in interviews, not even when the bank was under threat of acquisition. Stephen Rockridge, president and CEO of Rockridge Bank. 43 years old, Ivy League polished, Time Magazine's Southern Reformer, 2 years running. The man who had been groomed to modernize the face of the Southern banking industry. A trusted name in Atlanta finance. A figure so distant from scandal that even his critics had only praises to offer, until now. The entire lobby froze. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, phones lowered, pens dropped. A stunned stillness blanketed the marble floors. The security guard blinked twice, stepped aside involuntarily. His stance softened, not from deference to the elderly man he'd blocked moments ago, but to the man whose name adorned the brass plaque behind every teller's desk, Stephen D. Rockridge, Chief Executive Officer. Stephen stood tall in a tailored charcoal suit, but his posture betrayed tension. He wasn't composed, his shoulders were tight, his face strained, and his voice trembled faintly as he spoke again. "Let him in," he said to the guard, more like a father scolding a child than a boss issuing instruction. "Now." The security guard nodded, stepping aside without protest, his eyes flickering with discomfort. Henry didn't move. He simply stared up at Stephen, his cane frozen mid-step, his briefcase held with a grip so tight his knuckles turned pale. He said nothing. The name had reached him. It wasn't a mistake, but it wasn't forgiveness either. Stephen walked forward, each step a contradiction, hesitant yet urgent. For a man whose life was controlled down to the stitch in his tie, this was chaos. As he neared the elderly figure in the doorway, his mask of corporate certainty cracked. There was a flicker in his expression, a kind of pleading recognition, as if some deep part of him had been waiting for this moment longer than he cared to admit. "Father," he repeated, this time quieter, broken. "I didn't know you were coming." Still, Henry didn't answer. The bank staff watched like spectators to a play that none of them had read the script for. The receptionist, who once retreated, now stepped forward, only to be halted by a glance from Stephen. Interns peered around corners. A middle-aged branch manager with a Bluetooth headset froze mid-call. The lobby had become a living painting of disbelief, race and status colliding in one suspended moment. And then finally, Henry moved. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped across the threshold of the bank. He walked not toward Stephen, but past him. Not a glance, not a word, just silence. The only sound was the soft echo of his cane tapping against the marble floor, a sound that seemed to scrape away at the prestige of the building with every beat. Stephen's eyes followed him, helplessly. The man he had just called father had acknowledged him with nothing more than movement. No smile, no warmth, no redemption. The staff whispered now, fragments of confusion rippling across the room. Did he say father? Was that his dad? No, couldn't be. He's black. I thought Stephen was adopted. Why did he look so guilty? Somewhere, a senior officer in HR began typing furiously. Legal would have questions. PR would have a crisis. But none of it mattered in that moment. Not to Stephen, and certainly not to Henry. Stephen turned and walked briskly behind him, closing the distance but never daring to touch. Please, he said, voice dropping lower. Let's talk. I wanted to call. I didn't know how to. Henry reached the center of the lobby and stopped, eyes rising to the vaulted ceiling that shimmered with ornate chandeliers. He had helped design the first credit union for black workers in Atlanta during the 70s, and now he stood beneath an institution that had excluded his kind for decades. Everything he saw represented the cost of assimilation and the people it erased. Stephen stepped beside him, awkward in his presence. I can take you upstairs. We can talk in my office. I'll cancel my meetings. Still, Henry remained silent. His eyes drifted to the line of white faces behind the glass counters, the boardroom glass above, the unblinking security cameras. He remembered when these walls were first painted, when black janitors weren't allowed to eat lunch in the staff cafeteria. He had seen the mailroom. He had swept the floors. And now the son he never claimed as his own stood in charge of it all. No one in the bank knew their CEO was biracial. It wasn't listed in bios, never mentioned in interviews, not discussed at retreats. Stephen's mother, Eloise Rockridge, had been a young secretary at a civil rights legal clinic. She had met Henry there, briefly, and what followed was a secret too heavy for either of their families to carry. Stephen had been raised as white, sent to private schools, taught how to walk, speak, dress in a way that erased suspicion. When his skin tone lightened with age, the family chose silence, a silence that had become the Rockridge tradition. Until now. Stephen turned to face Henry fully. I didn't forget. I promise you, I didn't forget you. I wanted to reach out after Mother passed. I just didn't know if you'd even want to see me. The old man turned at last. Slowly, deliberately. Their eyes met, two sets of the same storm, separated by time and choices. And finally Henry spoke. You let them bury me alive, he said, voice like gravel. And now you call me father? The weight of it silenced the room again. No boardroom, no merger, no bank speech Stephen had ever given could prepare him for the force of that sentence. He looked away, ashamed. But Henry wasn't finished. His voice remained calm, but it cut deep. You passed their test. They let you in their world. But don't bring me into it now that you feel guilty. Stephen's shoulders slumped, the power drained from his frame. He looked like a man shrinking inside a suit too expensive for apology. Then, as if the moment wasn't already at its edge, Henry pulled something from his coat pocket, a folded, weathered envelope. He held it up for only Stephen to see, then slid it back without a word. Stephen recognized the handwriting. It was his mother's, the last letter she had ever written. And Henry had kept it all this time. As Stephen reached out trying to speak, Henry turned away once more, and this time he wasn't just refusing words. His eyes glistened with something far more dangerous than silence: disappointment. A buried story from the 1960s begins to rise, one that even the bank's marble walls can't contain. Henry sat down in the executive lounge of the bank with the grace of a man who had learned to carry grief without letting it show. Behind him, the soft buzz of murmured voices echoed like distant ghosts, but he barely heard them. His mind had already drifted backward, through time toward the red dirt roads and cotton fields of Greenwood, Mississippi, where his story had begun in a house with no electricity, no running water, and a roof that leaked whenever God cried too hard. Henry's early life in Mississippi was not unique for a black child in the 1940s. Born to Ezekiel and Marva Gaines, both sharecroppers who picked cotton from sunup to sundown, he had learned early that survival was about silence. White men could take more than land, they could take hope. Every morning, his father would rise before the rooster crowed, and Henry, even at 5, would be up right behind him, holding a tin bucket for water or oil, watching how the lines on his father's hands deepened with every season. They lived on land they did not own, harvesting crops they could never sell, under terms set by landlords who never once called them by their names. And yet, Ezekiel still believed in education. Every month he would walk miles to buy a used textbook for Henry from a second-hand market. They were books discarded by white schools. Pages torn, names scribbled out, but they held power. Henry read by lamplight until his eyes burned. He learned not just how to read, but how to see the world they weren't supposed to see, the one behind the curtain. Then came 1955. the year Emmett Till was murdered, not far from where Henry lived. Till's death electrified black communities like a shockwave. Henry remembered his father gathering neighbors around their small porch and saying, "If they can do that to a boy, what's left for our sons?" That night, Henry saw his mother cry for the first time. The civil rights movement came to Greenwood like a holy storm. Tent meetings, secret organizing, leaflets passed from one cracked hand to another. Henry was only 13 when he began running messages between activists, memorizing addresses and slogans like sacred scripture. The first time he was stopped by a white sheriff and asked where he was going, he lied and said he was headed to church. That lie probably saved his life. Tragedy entered quietly. His older brother Clarence, a bold and fearless teenager, joined a bus boycott in Jackson and never came back. The story went that he had been detained, but no one in the family ever saw him again. His name was never printed. His photo never circulated. His mother stopped setting a plate for him after the second winter, but Henry never did. In 1966, at the age of 20, Henry moved to New Orleans to work for a nonprofit distributing loans to black-owned businesses. He believed he could rewrite the economy one storefront at a time. It was during this period that he met Eloise, a white college intern from Atlanta volunteering during the summer for civil rights casework. She was intelligent, kind, and painfully naive about the weight of the skin she wore. They worked late hours together, writing grant proposals and meeting families who had been denied loans, housing, and safety. At first, they were just co-workers. But as the nights grew warmer and the riots louder, the space between them shrank. They would talk for hours about race, about pain, about the hypocrisy of a country that claimed freedom while holding its black children hostage in poverty. One night, after curfew, they kissed beneath the shadow of the levee. That kiss would plant the seed for a child neither family would accept. When Eloise discovered her pregnancy, she was disowned quietly but definitively. Her father, a well-known judge in Atlanta, arranged for her to move to a distant cousin's home in Connecticut for the duration of her pregnancy. She wrote to Henry, at first every week, but over time the letters stopped coming. Her final note was short. "I'm doing what's best for him. I'm sorry." Henry never saw his son, but he never forgot the child. Years passed. The Civil Rights Act was signed. Schools desegregated in ink, if not in truth. Henry stayed in the South, moved back to Atlanta, and became a financial consultant for black cooperatives. But the absence of that child followed him in the glint of a stranger's smile, in the curve of a young man's brow on the subway, in every brown-eyed boy who might have called him dad. He kept one letter from Eloise, the one with the child's birth date, June 20, 1982. That boy grew up to be Stephen D. Rockridge, a man with light skin, green eyes, and a last name so rooted in white tradition, it could have been carved in stone. Henry watched his rise from afar. When he first saw a news article announcing Stephen as the new CEO of Rockridge Bank, he felt as if the wind had been knocked from his chest. The name, the timeline, the resemblance. Still, he waited. Reached out to no one, made no noise, because that's what black men with secrets learn to do. Wait for the world to catch up, or for it to destroy you. What hurt the most wasn't just that Stephen had grown up with wealth, power, and prestige, but that he had never once acknowledged his blackness. Not once, not even as symbolic tribute. In 2020, Henry finally received a letter. It came through back channels, a legal mailer from Eloise's estate. She had passed. The envelope contained her last letter, a confession, a plea for Henry's forgiveness, a photo of a toddler, his son, and a warning, "He doesn't know, please don't hate him." And now, after nearly 4 decades, here he was, face to face with the man who had inherited a kingdom built on silence. Stephen had said father, but it was Henry who knew what that word really meant. Not just a title, but the weight of bloodlines, buried truths, and roads not taken. Henry reached into his coat and touched the folded letter once more. He could feel the texture of Eloise's pen strokes through the paper, as if time had pressed them there just for this day. As Henry unfolded the letter inside the dim lounge, his eyes widened, not at the contents but at what was missing. A section had been ripped out, gone, and scribbled in the corner, nearly faded, were 6 haunting words. "Ask him about the ledger, Henry. In a world divided by skin, even blood can be denied." The pages of the letter trembled faintly in Henry's hand as he reread those 6 faded words. "Ask him about the ledger, Henry." The meaning wasn't immediately clear, but it would be. Across the lounge, Stephen sat silent, his polished image now worn thin. His eyes, once sharp with confidence, now flickered with something closer to pleading. He looked like a man waiting for permission to be broken. But Henry wasn't ready to grant that. Instead, his mind slipped into the past, into a memory that hadn't surfaced in decades. He leaned back, and for a moment the noise of the bank faded into nothing but breath and thought. They had first met in 1996, outside the state courthouse during a civil rights event. Henry had returned to speak on behalf of community banking rights. Stephen, a sophomore at Emory, had been there as an observer sent by a curious professor, perhaps, or maybe some deeper, inexplicable pull. Henry had seen the young man standing alone, arms folded, expression unreadable. He looked out of place, too polished, too pale to blend in with the organizers, but too uncomfortable among the counter-protesters to belong to them either. When their eyes met, it was like staring into a photograph that had been torn in half. Stephen introduced himself with hesitation, saying he was studying finance, interested in equity, intrigued by social reform. But it wasn't the words that struck Henry. It was his voice, the rhythm of it, the subtle cadence of someone raised Southern, but not quite white. Henry had heard it before. Over the weeks that followed, they met in quiet corners of the city, coffee shops tucked between black bookstores and barber shops, far from campus, and further still from anything respectable in Stephen's growing world. They spoke of economics, legacy, and inequality, and over time, the unspoken crept into their talks. Stephen started to ask questions he wasn't sure how to phrase. Why his mother had grown solemn whenever the civil rights movement was mentioned. Why there were no photographs of his first 2 years. Why, when he was 9, his grandfather had angrily whispered, "You'll never be a Rockridge if you don't act like one." And eventually, he asked Henry something impossible. "Do you think we're related?" Henry didn't answer. Not then. But in the silence that followed, a different kind of connection formed. Fragile, delicate, but undeniable. They kept meeting in secret, these two men on opposite ends of Atlanta's caste line. Henry, older, wiser, careful. Stephen, restless, unsure, desperate for clarity. The danger was not in discovery, it was in the exposure of their truth. Because in Atlanta, even blood had a color. One night, Henry warned Stephen plainly, "If anyone finds out who you are, they'll ruin you. They'll strip everything you have." Stephen asked, "Then why do you keep meeting with me?" Henry had looked away, his voice soft, "Because no matter what, you're still mine." It wasn't a confession, it was a surrender. But the world outside their meetings didn't care for sentiment. It demanded structure, white over black, rich over poor, appearance over honesty. And when a journalist from a local political blog snapped a photo of the two of them outside a church basement, everything shifted. Stephen received a call the next morning from a Rockridge family lawyer, a quiet man named Gordon Braithwaite. Old money and older secrets. "You're making people nervous," Gordon said. "End it. No more contact. Not if you want to keep what's yours." Stephen didn't fight. He didn't even hesitate. That was the part Henry would never forget. He simply said, "Understood." 3 days later, Henry waited at the Greyhound station, like they had planned. They were supposed to take a trip, just a short one, to Memphis, to walk the places his brother Clarence had once marched. Stephen never showed. No call, no letter, only silence. And that silence grew into years. Back in the lounge, Henry's grip tightened around the letter as his gaze fixed on the man across from him. "You were supposed to meet me," he said, voice low but firm, "at the station." Stephen blinked, startled by the sudden words. "I know," he replied, shame washing over him. "I couldn't. I was told." "Told by who?" Henry cut in, already knowing the answer. Stephen exhaled, leaning forward, elbows on knees, like a man confessing to a murder. "Gordon Braithwaite. He said if I didn't stop seeing you, I'd lose everything. The internship, the inheritance, even the name." Henry's chest ached, not from betrayal, but from confirmation. "So you chose whiteness." Stephen flinched. "I didn't know what else to do. I was young. I didn't even know who I was." "You knew enough to leave." The words stung, but Stephen didn't deny them. He looked down, ashamed. Henry rose, slow and stiff. "You didn't just disappear, Stephen. You left me holding the weight alone, again." The room was so quiet, even the air felt afraid to move. Stephen looked up. "I read the letter, the one she wrote you. I found it in her things after she passed. That's why I came out today. I thought maybe it wasn't too late." Henry shook his head. "Late is what this world does to men like me. Late to give credit, late to say sorry, late to admit truth." Stephen stood now too, towering slightly but looking smaller somehow. "But I'm here now, I want to fix it." Henry pulled the letter from his coat again, and showed the ripped corner. "You didn't read all of it," he said. Stephen frowned. "What do you mean?" "She mentioned something in here, a ledger, something your family didn't want me to see." Stephen paled. "Ledger?" Ask your lawyer. Ask Braithwaite. He knows exactly what ledger she meant. The name made Stephen step back, visibly rattled. Gordon's still around. He's part of the foundation, but I haven't spoken to him since. Henry cut him off, voice sharp now. That's who told you to disappear, and that's who's still hiding the truth. Just then, a voice crackled from the overhead speaker, announcing the bank's senior board session was beginning, and as Stephen's phone buzzed with a notification, his eyes widened in horror. It was from Gordon Braithwaite. One line. He's digging too deep. End this now. Behind Atlanta's polished skyline lies a history of quiet discrimination that shaped its most powerful institutions. The message from Gordon Braithwaite still glowed on Stephen's phone screen, each word sinking deeper into his gut like cold lead. He's digging too deep. End this now. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a threat laced in professionalism, a warning from a man who didn't raise his voice because he never needed to. The machine had always spoken for him. Henry, standing across the room with the composure of a man used to being underestimated, caught the tension immediately. He didn't ask what the message said. He didn't need to. Men like Braithwaite had been whispering those same words behind boardroom doors and country club gates for generations, when the help got too loud, when the truth got too close. Stephen slid the phone into his pocket and looked at Henry. What's in the ledger? He asked, quieter now. Henry stepped toward his briefcase, his steps deliberate, his fingers trembled slightly, not from age but from the magnitude of what he was about to expose. He unlatched the case and pulled out a worn leather-bound folder, secured with a faded ribbon. It looked ancient, like something pulled from the back shelf of a church basement. He placed it gently on the table between them. You want to know the cost of power? Henry asked, voice low. It's in here. Atlanta wasn't always the beacon of black excellence. It marketed itself to be. Beneath the surface of its gleaming towers and bustling universities, the city was built on maps that kept black families out and systems that made sure they stayed out. The banks were the architects of those invisible walls. In the 1940s and 50s, just as the nation boomed after the war, Atlanta's elite used zoning codes and lending policies to draw invisible lines across the city. Neighborhoods were designated green, yellow, or red, based on the racial demographics of the residents. Green meant profitable, red meant black, red meant risk. It was called redlining. Banks, including Rockridge's predecessors, refused to lend money to black families, no matter their income, their savings, or their credit. Generations of black Atlantans were denied mortgages, forced into overcrowded neighborhoods, or preyed upon by slumlords. Meanwhile, white families built equity, bought homes, grew generational wealth. And they did it through institutions that smiled in public and bled black communities dry in private. Stephen sat down slowly as Henry laid out the folder's contents. This, Henry said, pulling out a series of carbon-copied forms, is a record of the loans denied by Rockridge Savings and Credit before it became Rockridge Bank. Every one of these applications came from black families, every single one marked with a red X. Stephen's throat tightened as he scanned the pages. The dates ranged from 1952 to 1971. Addresses that were now gentrified enclaves, family names long erased. Henry pointed to one line. This family right here. They applied 3 times. Father was a GO2I veteran, mother a schoolteacher. Denied every time. You know what sits on their old lot now? Stephen shook his head. A luxury condo, built with capital loaned by your bank. But Henry wasn't just there to recount injustice. He had been part of the resistance. After returning from New Orleans in the 1970s, Henry co-founded the Georgia Cooperative Credit Union for Black entrepreneurs. It was small, underfunded, and constantly under investigation, but it provided seed loans to barbershops, beauty salons, auto repair garages, and grocery stores, businesses that would have died without it. We didn't have much, Henry said, but we had each other, and we built something out of nothing. Then his voice grew harder. Until your bank bought up half the properties we'd invested in, raised rents, called in debt, dismantled our whole network within 5 years. Stephen swallowed hard. I didn't know. You were being groomed, Henry finished. I know. I watched it. Stephen's rise was no accident. He had interned at Merrill Lynch, consulted with Bain, and been featured on 30 Under 30 lists. He was the golden child of Atlanta's economic elite. But behind every accolade was a scaffold of inherited power, a machine that moved for him, opened doors he didn't even know were locked for others. And now, as he sat face to face with the man whose blood he shared, he saw clearly that his elevation had always required someone else's exclusion. Henry slid over the final document, a memo dated 1983, signed by Gordon Braithwaite. Read the second paragraph, he instructed. Stephen leaned in. It read, "In the interest of preserving the racial and financial integrity of our client base, all outreach must remain limited to approved districts. Applications from undesired areas should be redirected or dissolved with polite reasoning. We cannot jeopardize our image with progressive overreach." Stephen looked up. Jesus. Henry folded his hands. Your image was bought with silence. That silence has weight, and that weight crushed people like me, like your mother, like the families in those red zones. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was sacred. A moment suspended between generations. One that didn't demand pity, only truth. Then Henry added, "You're the CEO now. That means you have a choice. You can keep building on the same soil, or you can dig it up and admit it was poisoned." Stephen nodded slowly, but his hands betrayed him. They trembled as he clutched the folder. He asked, "Why now? Why come forward after all these years?" Henry met his gaze. "Because people like Braithwaite are still pulling strings. Because your mother tried to tell you. Because time's up." Stephen opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, Henry pulled one final sheet from his briefcase. It was stamped in red ink, a ledger title page. "Community Lending Exceptions, Confidential." Stephen leaned closer, eyes wide. Henry didn't blink. This was buried in a defunct archive. It proves the bank had a secret exception list. White families who received loans in red-line districts. Black families who were denied in green ones. Just as Stephen reached for the document, a loud knock echoed against the glass wall of the lounge. A senior board member, Evelyn Carr, stood outside, pale and nervous. She motioned Stephen toward her, her voice muffled but urgent. "They found out," she said through the door. "Legal's on their way up. Someone leaked the ledger." Even as the CEO, Stephen faced private resistance from the very people who praised him. Stephen didn't respond right away. Evelyn Carr stood outside the glass wall of the executive lounge, her eyes darting behind her as if the hallway itself were listening. Her normally pristine composure, a trademark among the Rockridge board, was now cracked, revealing fear behind her tight smile. "Legal's coming," she whispered. "The ledger. It's been leaked." Stephen's fingers curled around the folder Henry had just handed him. For a moment, he didn't move. The realization sank in like ice through his spine. Someone inside the building had known about the ledger and was scared enough to try and bury it. He looked at Henry. "This is bigger than just my past." Henry gave a half nod. It always was. Stephen stepped out of the lounge and into the corridor with Evelyn trailing close behind. They passed portraits of Rockridge founders, stern, white men in stiff collars and dead eyes. Their gazes seemed to follow Stephen down the corridor like ghosts defending their dynasty. At the end of the hallway stood the double mahogany doors of the executive boardroom, a space Stephen had occupied countless times, but never like this. Each time he had entered in the past, it had been with calculated posture, practiced restraint, and the quiet awareness that he had to work twice as hard to be seen as just as good. He pushed the doors open. Inside, the board members were already gathered around the table, 10 of them, all in tailored suits and cautious expressions. They looked up as he entered, and a sudden hush fell across the room. Stephen could feel the air shift, not because of what he had brought, but because of who stood behind him. Henry followed him in. Evelyn gasped softly. A younger board member, a man named Cliff Wallace, rose halfway from his chair and immediately sat back down. The others remained still, their expressions veiled in faux curiosity, but their eyes betrayed them. Some flicked toward Henry's dark skin, others toward Stephen with thinly veiled concern. One older gentleman, Alistair Dunn, who had served on the board longer than Stephen had been alive, tightened his jaw and leaned forward. "Stephen," Alistair began. "What is this?" Stephen didn't answer. He walked to the head of the table, placed the leather-bound folder at the center, and opened it. "This," he said, "is the truth about how Rockridge Bank became what it is today." Gasps, shuffling. Someone coughed as if clearing the weight from their chest. The documents inside the folder, copied loan denial slips, internal memos, Braithwaite's racially coded instructions, glared under the overhead lights. Stephen's voice was calm, but deliberate. For over half a century, our institution profited off discriminatory practices. Families were denied mortgages. Neighborhoods were strategically underfunded. Businesses were suffocated before they could breathe. This wasn't accidental. It was policy. Alistair's nostrils flared. "We've done good work in recent years. Diversity programs, outreach, band-aids on bullet wounds." Henry interrupted, his voice cutting across the room like wind through brittle trees. "You didn't fix the system. You buried it alive." All heads turned toward Henry. Alistair's face paled, and suddenly, visibly, undeniably, recognition flashed across his features. "You," he whispered. You were at the New Orleans summit. Henry didn't blink. And you were the man who walked out when we presented the proposal for the Black Community Loan Fund. Alistair stood up slowly, panic creeping into his composure. You shouldn't be here. But I am, Henry said, and I'm not leaving. Stephen scanned the room. None of you asked where our capital really came from. You just nodded when the numbers went up. But we built our empire on exploitation, and I won't lead it with that blood on my hands. A young woman named Maya Chen, the board's legal advisor, spoke cautiously. Stephen, this could destroy our reputation. Our shareholders. Our reputation, Stephen said, was built on a lie. Henry looked at her. Your shareholders live in houses they could afford because we couldn't. They built trust funds off our locked doors. And now you want to protect them. Maya hesitated. Alistair's hands trembled. If this goes public, the media...
The media's already sniffing around, Evelyn said, voice thin. They know something broke. They just don't know where.
Stephen looked at her, then at the rest of the board. Then it's time we tell them. All of it. What are you suggesting? Cliff Wallace asked. Full disclosure, Stephen said. We release the documents, apologize, start a restitution fund for the communities we harmed. We restructure the bank's policies, including who gets to sit on this board. Alistair's voice shot up. You're talking about destroying everything. No, Henry said, calm but firm. He's talking about saving it, or at least making it worth saving. The boardroom fell into tense silence. Then Evelyn spoke, more to herself than anyone else. They'll never allow this. The Rockridge Trust still owns 48% of the bank. Stephen nodded. Then we find a way around them, or we force their hand. The tension was thick, but just as the discussion began to spiral, the unexpected twist came. A junior board secretary stepped into the room, eyes wide, holding a letter. It's from the Department of Financial Oversight, she said, breathless. They've launched an investigation. Anonymous tip. Someone filed a formal complaint using the ledger documents. Stephen's heart dropped. He hadn't leaked the documents. Neither had Henry. Which meant someone else inside the bank had... Someone who wanted the truth out, even if it burned everything down. As the room processed the revelation, Henry slowly turned to Alistair and asked the question no one expected. Who else in this room signed the original Red Line memo? Alistair's silence said everything. Then Evelyn spoke, her voice cold, distant, and stunned. God help us, it wasn't just him. A ledger hidden in a safety deposit box reveals that Henry built the bank's foundation, literally and financially. The word hung in the boardroom like smoke from a hidden fire. It wasn't just him. Evelyn's voice cracked under its own weight, the shock beginning to sink beneath the surface of corporate polish and into the bones of those seated around the table. Stephen stood motionless, his mind spinning through every boardroom handshake, every sideways glance over the years, every subtle gatekeeping comment disguised as professional caution. Henry didn't react. He had long ago learned not to be shocked when whiteness revealed its true depth, layered, generational, deliberate. His eyes moved slowly from face to face, pausing not with judgment but with a quiet certainty that he had seen this before. The moment cracked when Maya Chen, still holding the letter from the Department of Financial Oversight, looked directly at Stephen. If they dig deep enough, she said slowly, they won't just find the Red Line documents, they'll find the other files. Her voice lowered, fear creeping in. The original equity ledger, the bloodline account. Stephen turned toward her. What bloodline account? Maya hesitated. You were never supposed to know about it. It was sealed. But if the documents Henry has are legit, there's a risk they'll stumble on the old archives. Her eyes flicked to Henry. He's the key to all of it. For a split second, Stephen thought she meant it symbolically. But Henry knew better. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded envelope. Your mother tried to leave me more than a letter, he said softly. She left me a name and a key. Safety deposit box number 11749 at Union Hill Storage Bank. Evelyn went pale. That's not possible. That box was closed decades ago. No, Henry corrected. It was hidden. She prepaid the lease through a third party. Never put her name on the paperwork. Stephen locked eyes with him. And what's in the box? Henry stepped closer, voice steady and stripped of any emotion. The original shareholder ledger, handwritten by Charles Rockridge himself. It includes names, payments, labor agreements, unofficial records of who funded the first 4 Rockridge buildings. Stephen frowned. You mean investors? No, Henry said. I mean laborers, craftsmen, and one man in particular who was promised equity, who was cut out before the first dividend was ever paid. The room tensed. Maya slowly sat down. Evelyn whispered, "Oh my God." Alistair didn't speak. He just stared at the window as if hoping the cityscape could erase what he already knew. Henry stepped to the center of the table. My father, Ezekiel Gaines, built the foundation of this bank, not metaphorically, physically. He laid the bricks, wired the electricity, plastered the walls. He and 50 other black men worked under dangerous conditions for almost nothing. In exchange, Charles Rockridge offered them shares in a future wealth agreement. A promise that when the bank turned its first profit, they would each receive 1% equity. Evelyn shook her head, dazed. That story's never been in our records. Henry's eyes darkened, because it was scrubbed. Stephen opened the folder and pulled out a scanned letter, yellowed and fading. This was mailed to my mother in 1979, Henry said. It was addressed from a paralegal who claimed the original ledger had been buried due to legal concerns over non-traditional labor contracts. But here's the kicker. He included a photocopy of the ledger's first page, and my father's name was at the top. The air in the room shifted again. The weight of injustice was no longer abstract. It had names, dates, and handwritten ink. Henry's voice turned razor sharp. But that's not the only name you'll see in that book. You'll see mine too. Because in 1967, I filed for a community banking patent, a model built on cooperative wealth distribution. I pitched it to Rockridge Savings when they expanded their second branch. They stole my model, rewrote the terms, and launched their neighborhood growth program without crediting a single black contributor. That program laid the foundation for what this bank became. Evelyn whispered, "That's our legacy initiative." Henry didn't flinch. "Your legacy is theft." Stephen turned the letter over. There was a note attached in delicate cursive. It was from Eloise. "I couldn't protect you then," it read. "But I hope this key gives you the power to take your place. Forgive me." Henry looked away, grief blooming quietly behind his eyes. Stephen ran a hand through his hair, his world tilting beneath him. "So what you're saying is, legally the bank never had full claim to its own foundation." "Exactly," Henry replied. "If that ledger resurfaces, the legal implications will destroy any claim to sole family ownership, and it opens the door to class action lawsuits from the descendants of those original laborers." Maya leaned forward. "And if you can prove it was buried intentionally, then we're not just talking about restitution," Henry said. "We're talking about criminal fraud." The silence was suffocating. Cliff Wallace finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "If that ledger exists, then Stephen, he may not even be the legal heir to the Rockridge fortune." Henry stepped back, letting the gravity settle. "That's correct. Because the last page of the copy I received included something else. A draft of Charles Rockridge's original will, handwritten, unnotarized, but dated. And do you know what it says?" Stephen stared at him. Henry's voice dropped to a hush. "It names me as his heir." No one moved, not even Alistair. "Not as CEO," Henry continued. "Not as some token board member. As successor. Because Charles knew. He knew about Eloise and me. He knew I built that foundation. He knew I was blood." Stephen's heart dropped. It wasn't just about legacy now. It was about identity, about history so tightly woven into power that pulling one thread threatened to unravel the entire tapestry. Evelyn finally broke. "We have to contain this. If the press gets the will, it's already too late," Henry said. "Your system taught me to keep receipts, and I've kept every one." Stephen leaned back in his chair, his hands trembling slightly. He didn't know whether to feel relieved or betrayed. The name Rockridge had always felt like borrowed armor, heavy and sharp. Now it felt like a lie. He looked up at Henry. "So what do you want? What happens now?" Henry's response was calm but chilling. "I don't want your position. I want the truth. I want every family robbed by this place to be made whole. And I want you to choose. Will you keep pretending you earned that chair, or will you help dismantle the lie it sits on?" Stephen didn't answer. Not yet. His gaze drifted to the window, to the city that glittered below them, built on promises and shadows. Then Henry added, almost as an afterthought, "And by the way, the ledger? It's not the only thing in that box." Stephen's eyes snapped back. "What else is there?" Henry's lips curled slightly, not in a smile, but in a knowing gesture that came from decades of being ignored and underestimated. The original tape recording of Charles Rockridge reading his will. Before Stephen could respond, his assistant burst into the boardroom breathless. "There's a news crew in the lobby. Someone tipped off Channel 5. They're asking for you and for Mr. Gaines by name." Forgotten files buried under decades of dust begin to rewrite history. Stephen barely had time to process the assistant's breathless announcement. The room felt like it had dropped a few degrees. Channel 5. Henry's name. A lobby full of cameras. It was the moment they'd all feared, but none of them were ready for. The board members exchanged frantic glances, legal implications dancing in their minds, reputations trembling on a precipice. while the upstairs unraveled, 3 floors below, inside the dimly lit storage archives beneath Rockridge Bank's main headquarters, an entirely different kind of reckoning was unfolding. Jordan Price, a 24-year-old summer intern with a political science degree from Morehouse and a quiet distrust of legacy institutions, was elbow-deep in dust-covered boxes. He hadn't been sent to find anything in particular. The assignment had been vague: digitize old personnel files, scan documents from the pre-1990s era for record-keeping, a task usually reserved for clerks or outsourced contractors. But Jordan had volunteered. Something about the history of Rockridge, about its polished surface and surgically neat narratives, had always bothered him. He slid open a rusted metal drawer labeled 1972, Community Relations. Inside were misfiled memos, carbon copies with fading ink, and handwritten notes scrawled in anxious cursive. The air was stale. The folders felt untouched for decades. But it wasn't until he reached the bottom of the drawer that he found the box labeled Employee Incidents, Archive Only. Inside it was a folder so brittle it cracked at the seams when he opened it. The pages inside weren't just administrative, they were explosive. Typed reports of internal complaints, mostly from black employees, about workplace discrimination, slurs written in quotation marks, descriptions of jokes told during team meetings, supervisors accused of ignoring complaints. One memo, dated June 1976, chilled him. It detailed a formal complaint from a black janitor named Clyde Thompson. The complaint outlined repeated racial abuse from his white supervisor, including being forced to clean restrooms while others took long breaks, being referred to as boy, and even being told to use a separate staff entrance. The memo had a scribbled note beside it in blue pen: dismissed, too sensitive. Another, from 1980, involved a senior loan officer reprimanded not for racial comments, but for disrupting office morale by hiring too many black applicants. The irony was sickening. Jordan kept reading, the bile rising in his throat. As he turned another fragile page, a photograph fell out from between the papers. It was old, curled at the edges, and black and white. But the moment he saw the faces, he froze. There she was, Eloise Rockridge, elegant and smiling, her hair pulled into a perfect 1960s bun, and standing next to her, hand lightly on her back, was a younger version of the man now dominating headlines, Henry Gaines. The intimacy in the photo was unmistakable. It wasn't posed for press or professionalism. There was something in their body language, in the proximity of their smiles, that whispered of shared history, of affection that had survived dangerous boundaries. Jordan's hands shook as he placed the photo beside the memos. He needed to know what else was hidden. He dug deeper, uncovering a cassette tape marked only with CR 11568, and behind it another ledger, this one more handwritten than typed, with dozens of red underlines and stars. It was labeled Foundation Agreements, Unratified. Jordan squinted at the first page. Names, dozens of them. Black names. Next to them were labor codes, dates of employment, and a curious column labeled Deferred Equity Consideration. The numbers were circled but never paid out. There were check marks next to a few, X's next to most. One name at the top, Ezekiel Gaines. The tape, the photo, the memos, the ledger. He pulled out his phone and snapped photos of everything. He wasn't sure what he'd do with them yet, but something told him these pieces didn't just explain the past, they indicted it. Back upstairs, chaos was brewing. The news crew had been kept outside the lobby by security, but word was spreading fast through social media. The phrase Rockridge Reckoning had started trending. Leaked documents were already circulating online. Names were being named. And worst of all, someone had posted a digital scan of a photo, the very one Jordan had just found. Stephen stood by the lobby's main window, watching a growing crowd gather on the sidewalk. They were holding signs. Some had come in protest, some in support. But all of them were asking the same question: who built this bank, and who was buried to make room for its marble floors? Inside the boardroom, Henry sat alone now. The others had scattered, some to manage the media, others to hide from it. He held his copy of the ledger loosely, his thoughts lost in the noise. The cracks in the institution had become canyons, and the very ground beneath their legacy was giving way. Stephen returned from the lobby, face pale. "It's out," he said. "Everything. That photo, it hit the internet 5 minutes ago." Henry didn't flinch. "Then it's time to stop hiding. Some of them are already calling it a scandal," Stephen added. "They're framing it like your mother, like she had an affair with the help." Henry chuckled dryly, without humor. "They've always seen me as the help. Even when I built the walls they hide behind." Stephen sat across from him. "The photo proves it. You and my mother. People will finally believe it." Henry leaned forward. "The photo isn't proof. Love was proof. Silence was punishment. Stephen's jaw tightened. What do we do now? Henry looked toward the window, where protest signs now bobbed like waves against the glass. You tell the truth, not just the corporate version, the real one. You tell them who I am. You tell them who you are. Jordan burst through the boardroom doors, out of breath, holding the photograph, the ledger, and the cassette tape in his hands. I found it all, he said, but there's something else. You need to hear what's on this tape. It's not just a will, it's a confession. Even as truths emerge, justice remains unwanted in white spaces. Jordan's words echoed in the boardroom, like a bullet fired into a still church. It's not just a will, it's a confession. He held the cassette like it was a sacred relic, the weight of truth humming inside its plastic shell. Stephen reached for it slowly, his fingers brushing the label, CR 11568, his breath catching. Henry didn't move. He stared at the tape, but his eyes were somewhere else. Decades back, where silence had been a survival strategy, and truth had a cost too high to pay in full. But just as the tension mounted, the door creaked open again, this time with more authority. A sharply dressed man in a navy suit and thin glasses stepped inside without introduction. His face was familiar, his presence more so. Douglas Riley, the bank's lead legal counsel. Behind him followed two others from corporate law, their briefcases clicking shut as they surveyed the scene like cleanup crews at a crime scene. We need to speak, now, Douglas said flatly, eyes cutting toward Henry. In private. Stephen didn't flinch. No, you'll speak in front of everyone. Douglas gave a patronizing half smile. This isn't optional. Henry stood, surprisingly calm. Let him speak, he said to Stephen. I've faced men like him all my life. They wear different suits now, but the tune never changes. Douglas's jaw twitched at the remark but continued. Mr. Gaines, it has come to our attention that you are in possession of confidential bank materials, property of Rockridge Bank, including internal documents, ledgers, and unreleased legal recordings. Possession and dissemination of such material constitutes theft of corporate property and potential defamation. Stephen stepped between them. They're not corporate materials, if they're evidence. They're still protected under privacy clauses, many of them tied to inheritance agreements. If you go public with any of it, Douglas said, now looking squarely at Henry, we will pursue full legal action, both criminal and civil. Henry didn't blink. Do what you have to. I've been sued, jailed, and beaten before. But this time, I've got the truth, and a crowd outside waiting to hear it. Douglas turned his focus to Stephen now. As CEO, you are bound by fiduciary duty to protect this institution. If you endorse this man's claims, or allow any of these documents to go public, you will be considered in breach of contract. The board will remove you. The shareholders will sue. You will lose everything, your position, your reputation, your inheritance. Stephen stared back, his expression unreadable. Henry spoke again, his voice low but steady. There it is, the decision every one of us has had to make at some point, to kneel to power or to stand with truth. They always tell us we're threatening the system, but what they really fear is that we'll finally make the system see itself. Douglas scoffed, then stepped back. You have until the end of the day to issue a statement denying Mr. Gaines' claims. If you don't, we proceed. Consider this your formal notice. As the lawyers left, the room grew quiet again. Jordan placed the tape on the table, now heavy with urgency. Henry sat down, resting his hand on it like a benediction. They're not bluffing, Stephen said finally. They'll bury me. Henry looked at him, expression carved in quiet fire. Then let them try, but you'll know who you are when the dirt settles. Outside, the protests had swelled. More signs, more chants. But it wasn't a single movement anymore. It had splintered. On one side were those calling for justice, reparations, a reckoning. On the other were counter-protesters, holding signs that read, "Don't rewrite history. White guilt is not justice, and keep Rockridge clean." The media had turned the conflict into a spectacle. Cable news anchors sat comfortably in air-conditioned studios, arguing whether Henry was a hero or an opportunist. Opinion pieces debated whether the bank should apologize or move on. Right-wing talk shows called it an orchestrated smear campaign against white legacy. Some blogs even suggested Henry had forged the ledger. Legal letters began flooding Henry's mailbox. Old city permits he'd filed decades ago were suddenly being audited. His former tax filings were requested for review. Subtle attacks, all meant to rattle him, to remind him who still controlled the levers. But Henry remained steady. They can throw paperwork at me, he told Stephen, but they can't change what's already changed. The people know now. The city knows. Stephen wasn't so sure. That afternoon, the board convened behind closed doors without him. He was informed by memo that his role was under internal review and that an executive statement distancing the bank from unauthorized historical claims was being prepared. He walked into his office, shut the door, and looked out at the crowd below, half cheering, half jeering. He could see the flash of cameras, the rise and fall of chants, the white signs with bold black letters, both for and against him. He had become the face of something neither side fully understood. A man born of contradiction, caught between the past he inherited and the future he hadn't yet earned. His phone buzzed. A message from Gordon Braithwaite. Choose the bank or the story. Stephen placed the phone down, then turned to Henry, who had followed him in silently. What would you do if you were me? Stephen asked. Henry smiled, but it wasn't kind. You're asking the wrong question. The real one is, who will you be after you choose? Stephen walked over to his desk, opened the drawer, and pulled out a pre-drafted statement the PR team had prepared. It denied the existence of the ledger, called Henry's claims emotionally charged misinformation, labeled the photo of his mother a likely fabrication. He held it in his hands, reading the words as if they belonged to someone else. Henry said nothing. He didn't have to. Stephen slowly reached for his pen, but instead of signing the denial letter, he turned it over and wrote 2 words across the back. Play it. He slid the cassette into the old recorder on the shelf behind him. The tape clicked. Then the voice of Charles Rockridge filled the room, trembling with age, regret, and a secret no one was ready for. This institution was never just mine, and there is something I must confess. History doesn't die, it waits. The static on the cassette faded into the trembling voice of Charles Rockridge. This institution was never just mine, and there is something I must confess. The words hung in the air like ash from a fire, long buried but never extinguished. Henry stood still, eyes closed as if letting the confession soak through bone. Stephen listened, paralyzed, knowing the tape would ignite something far older and deeper than anything corporate policy could contain. But before the tape finished, before Charles admitted the full truth of his silent collusion and the illegitimate bloodline he had concealed, Henry stepped away. He left the room, the tape still spinning behind him, and walked into the hallway like a man who knew the fire had been reignited and that his body still remembered its heat. And in his mind, he was no longer in a high-rise bank. He was back in 1968. The year Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. The year cities burned. The year silence was no longer survival. It was complicity. In the stillness of his thoughts, Atlanta morphed around him. Gone were the mirrored windows and suits. In their place, smoke bloomed above Auburn Avenue. Car tires screeched across cracked streets. A black child screamed somewhere behind a broken storefront. It was April 5th, the day after King's death, and Henry was 22. He had been standing on the corner of Butler Street with a bullhorn in one hand and his mother's scarf wrapped around his face, not to hide his identity, but to keep from choking on the tear gas that coated the city. Beside him stood students from Spelman and Morehouse, church deacons, factory workers, all marching, not in rage but in mourning that bled into resistance. They didn't carry Molotovs, they carried signs. We are not your enemy. Silence is betrayal. Justice or else. Henry had marched from downtown to Old Fourth Ward, hand in hand with his brother Clarence. Clarence had always been louder, bolder, the one who didn't believe in compromise. Where Henry calculated, Clarence moved on instinct. But on that day, they were united. They stood shoulder to shoulder, chanting King's final words. I may not get there with you, not realizing how soon one of them wouldn't. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops, a line of National Guardsmen blocked the intersection. Without warning, the chants were drowned by the hiss of canisters and the crack of batons. The peaceful protest shattered. Chaos surged. Henry remembered falling, a blow to his ribs, the sound of Clarence shouting, then being dragged into a police van. Henry, blinded by blood and gas, was pulled away by a stranger and hidden behind a dumpster until dawn. The next morning, the headlines read, "Rioters clash with police. 37 arrested." Not one mention of King. Not one mention of peace. Henry tried for weeks to find his brother. No police report, no booking record. Just silence. Their mother, Marva, knocked on every door of every official she could find. She carried Clarence's photo until it was creased and smudged into a blur, but no one ever answered her calls. Clarence Gaines had vanished like so many others, swallowed whole by a system that knew how to make people disappear without lifting a finger. Henry carried that guilt into every protest afterward. Every speech, every vote. He never stopped wondering what would have happened if he'd held on tighter, if he'd stood closer, if he'd taken the blow meant for his brother. Those questions turned into a quiet fire, one that fueled his life's work but never gave him peace. Now, as the present unfolded in chaotic symmetry, The fire returned. History didn't die. It waited. Stephen found Henry in a back stairwell minutes later, leaning against the wall like it was holding him up. "You okay?" Stephen asked. Henry didn't answer at first. They think justice is a memo, a press release, but justice is remembering. Stephen nodded. "The tape, it's strong. He names you, talks about the deal with your father, admits he knew everything, that you were his blood, that the board forced him into silence." Henry chuckled bitterly. "Even in confession they call it force, never choice." Stephen hesitated, then held out a manila envelope. "This came in the mailroom an hour ago. No return address. No postage. Just your name." Henry opened it slowly. Inside was a letter, aged but preserved in a plastic sleeve. The handwriting was familiar. He read the first line and his knees nearly gave out. "Dear Henry, if you're reading this, then somehow I've made it out long enough for the truth to reach you." It was signed, Clarence Gaines. Stephen helped him sit as Henry's hands trembled. The letter continued. "They took me in '68, held me without charge, then moved me to a prison in Mississippi under a false name, said I was part of a communist ring, said I'd disappear if I didn't play along. So I played. For a while, but I never forgot you, I never blamed you. I just wanted you to know I'm alive, or at least I was when I wrote this. If you're holding this letter, it means someone smuggled it out. Maybe someone still believes in truth. Maybe justice does come eventually." There was more details about the prison. The names of guards who abused inmates. A plea for Henry to keep fighting. "Tell them we were here." The final line read, "Tell them we mattered." Tears slid down Henry's cheeks, not just for his brother, but for every soul swallowed by silence. Stephen put a hand on his shoulder. "This changes everything." Henry wiped his face. "No. It reveals what never changed." Just then Jordan rushed down the hall, phone in hand. "You both need to see this. Someone just posted a video clip of Clarence, alive, last week, in a care facility in Mississippi. He's been found." Truth finally finds a microphone. The sun hung low over downtown Atlanta, casting long golden shadows across the plaza outside Rockridge Bank. Reporters crowded behind barricades, their microphones pointed toward a temporary podium wrapped in white cloth. Protesters flanked both sides of the square, some holding signs with Henry's face printed beneath the word truth, others with posters reading "Protect the Bank" and "Race doesn't equal ownership." The air vibrated with tension. Helicopters hovered above like vultures, camera lights flickered, every face waited for a voice brave enough to break the silence. Stephen stood backstage, staring at the statement in his hand. The PR team had rewritten it 4 times. The board had demanded redactions. Legal had pleaded neutrality, but he had decided none of it mattered anymore. What was the point of legacy if it stood on lies? Henry, dressed in a plain navy suit and dark leather shoes, still scuffed from protest marches of his youth, stood beside him. He held no notes. He had made his peace with improvisation long ago. He wasn't there to perform. He was there to finish a sentence he had started in 1968. Jordan, standing near the steps, signaled that the microphones were live. News networks had interrupted their programming. The country was watching. Stephen stepped forward first. The crowd quieted. The flashbulbs burst. And for the first time in his career, Stephen Rockridge didn't speak like a CEO. He spoke like a man trying to breathe underwater. "My name is Stephen D. Rockridge, and for years I've benefited from a legacy built on theft, silence, and racial exclusion." The murmurs began immediately. "My family, myself included, knowingly profited from a system that robbed black families of opportunity and equity, and I can no longer pretend that my success was earned in isolation." A reporter shouted, "Are you admitting to corporate fraud?" Stephen didn't flinch. "I'm admitting to something worse. I'm admitting to willful blindness, to choosing comfort over accountability, and to hiding the truth about who built this bank." He paused. "I am the biological son of Henry L. Gaines, the rightful heir to this institution's foundation, and today I am stepping down as CEO to ensure that restitution isn't just symbolic, it's structural." The crowd erupted. Cheers, gasps, arguments. A white man in a red tie shouted, "This is reverse racism," while an older black woman sobbed behind the barrier, whispering, "We finally made them say it." Henry stepped up next. For the first few seconds he said nothing. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the pages Stephen had left behind. Then he spoke. "My name is Henry Gaines. I was born into the red clay of Mississippi, raised under laws that saw my skin as a liability. I was promised a seat at this table long before most of you knew it existed, but every time I knocked, they changed the locks." He looked directly into the crowd. "This is not just about me, or about Stephen. This is about the generations of black families who were denied loans, homes, futures. whose hands built the bones of this city, only to be erased from its walls. He held up a copy of the original ledger. This is what they buried. And this, he raised the cassette tape, is what they feared. Jordan uploaded the full audio of Charles Rockridge's confession live, seconds after Henry's speech ended. Across social media, the clip caught fire. People didn't just listen, they shared it with captions like, "The truth that built Atlanta," and he named Henry his heir. But not everyone was moved. Cable news networks split down predictable lines. Some hosts praised Stephen's courage. Others questioned the legality of Henry's claims. Commentators accused him of manipulating a historical grievance for modern racial revenge. Others framed it as a war on white legacy. A prominent radio host declared it the end of American capitalism. One conservative columnist titled her piece, "From CEO to CRT Pawn, The Fall of Stephen Rockridge." Even within Atlanta, the response fractured. Some Rockridge clients closed their accounts in protest. Others opened new ones, citing the bank's honesty as a reason. Local churches hosted prayer vigils in Henry's honor. Meanwhile, an anonymous group spray-painted "Liar" across the bank's front entrance that night. That same evening, Stephen's office received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a copy of the bank's original 1923 charter. Jordan opened it first, then handed it to Henry. Both men froze. On page 6, buried in fine print, was a clause highlighted in blue. In the event that original founders or their direct descendants present a valid legal claim of omission or exclusion, the institution is required to allocate no less than 25% of its equity holdings to said parties, retroactively, and with compounding interest. Stephen read it twice. This was written into the charter. Henry stared at the page. They knew this day could come. Jordan's voice cracked. "Do you know what this means?" Henry didn't smile. Not fully. But there was a shift in his voice. "It means they didn't just owe us acknowledgement. They owe us everything." Before Stephen could reply, Evelyn Carr stormed into the room, eyes wide, her voice trembling. "You need to see this. Gordon Braithwaite just filed an emergency injunction, and he's claiming Henry is not your father." Sometimes the loudest pain is passed down in silence. The moment Evelyn Carr uttered those words, "Gordon Braithwaite just filed an emergency injunction, claiming Henry is not your father," Stephen felt something shift inside him. Not shock, not even anger. It was quieter than that. A hollow ache that pressed against his ribs like a phantom limb, the echo of a truth he had always known but had never fully lived. Henry didn't blink. He stared straight at Evelyn, her hands trembling as she held the legal document, eyes flickering with panic, maybe regret. Stephen looked down at the paper she handed him, the legal jargon dense and deliberate, as if trying to bury doubt beneath paragraphs. "Petition for injunctive relief on the grounds of disputed paternity," it read. A challenge to everything they had just revealed, an attack on bloodlines, on memory, on identity. "They think this will break you," Henry said calmly. Stephen nodded, jaw tight. "They think if they erase our connection, they can erase your claim." But it wasn't about the money, or the title, or even the bank. It was about belonging, something Stephen had never quite grasped, even when he thought he had it all. After the press conference, after the interviews, after the chance had faded and the plaza emptied, Stephen found himself alone in his office, lights dimmed, blinds closed. The world outside was spinning with speculation and scandal. Inside, he sat motionless at his desk. One photo clutched in his hand, the photo Jordan had uncovered, of Eloise and Henry, smiling softly beneath the weight of the world they couldn't change. He closed his eyes. And it all came rushing back. The childhood questions his mother never answered. The whispered arguments she had with his grandfather behind closed doors. The time she pulled him close, sobbing into his shoulder, whispering, "You are not who they say you are." He hadn't understood then. He was only 10. But he felt it. That was the day he stopped asking questions. Because the answers were too painful to hold. The next morning, Stephen checked himself into a private therapy clinic outside the city. No press, no board members, just silence. And for once, he didn't run from it. The therapist, an older black woman named Dr. Miriam Lacey, asked him one question during their first session. "Who raised you to believe that the truth could be dangerous?" He didn't know how to answer. So she gave him a journal. In it, Stephen wrote for days about his mother's gentle defiance, about the grandfather who called integration a mistake, about the prep school where black students were paraded like diversity trophies, about the lunch tables that divided themselves by color even when the school claimed to be post-racial, about the friend he stopped talking to in college because someone whispered, "You don't want to look too urban." He wrote about silence, not the kind that protects peace, but the kind that strangles it. And as he wrote, the truth began to surface. Stephen had never chosen whiteness. It had been chosen for him.
Built for him. Structured to welcome him so long as he played along.
So long as he wore the suit, said the right words, and kept history at arm's length. His skin tone had bought him a seat at tables where his father would have been turned away. His mother's last request to keep quiet, to survive, had become his mantra. But it had cost him everything that made him real. Dr. Lacey listened as he confessed the guilt, the shame, the anger, not just at Gordon or the board or the system, but at himself, for letting the silence fester, for letting it win. He told her about the relationships he'd lost, the college girlfriend who asked too many questions about his past, the black colleague he'd avoided mentoring because he feared the board would label him biased, the speeches he gave where every line was calculated to avoid the word race, and the haunting realization that his success had always been padded by someone else's invisibility. Dr. Lacey asked him something else. "What does Henry mean to you?" Stephen answered without hesitation. "He's the only honest thing I've ever had." Back at the bank, things were unraveling. Shareholders were in chaos. Public opinion was divided. Gordon Braithwaite had launched a campaign to invalidate Henry's claim, dredging up obscure paternity cases, parading them on news channels, suggesting Henry had forged the documents. But Henry never flinched, because he had nothing left to prove. He didn't need a DNA test to confirm what the world already saw in Stephen's face. The final straw came quietly. One evening, as Stephen returned from a therapy session, he found an envelope at his apartment door. Inside was a single photo, Clarence Gaines, sitting in a sunlit chair at the Mississippi Care Facility. Written on the back in unfamiliar handwriting were the words, "He's asking for you both. But time is short." Stephen stared at the photo for a long time. Then he called Henry. The old man's voice was quiet, tired. "I was just about to leave." "You're going to him?" Stephen asked. Henry hesitated. "I don't know if he'll recognize me, but if there's even a chance, I have to try." Stephen looked out at the city, its lights flickering like static in a broken transmission. "I'll come with you." There was a long pause. Then Henry said, "All right, but understand something. This won't be closure. It'll just be truth." Stephen nodded. "That's all I want." Henry exhaled. "I'll pick you up at dawn." But as Stephen hung up, his phone buzzed with a new notification. The results of a quietly ordered DNA test, one Gordon had forced the court to expedite, had been leaked, and the result read, "Paternity inconclusive. Evidence compromised." Stephen froze, because attached was a note from Gordon's office. "You're not his son. You never were." Institutions don't just inherit money, they inherit guilt. Stephen sat motionless in his apartment, the words from Gordon's office still glowing on the screen. "You're not his son. You never were." The DNA test had been labeled inconclusive, citing chain of custody issues, improperly stored samples, and interference from unknown agents. But Gordon's note, the confidence in its tone, was the real dagger. It wasn't scientific, it was strategic. Psychological warfare, from a man who had built a career on burying truths beneath cold, legal precision. Stephen didn't forward the results to Henry. He didn't speak of them when dawn came, and they drove in silence toward Mississippi. Because somewhere inside he knew that biology had nothing on memory, and history had never needed confirmation to wound. They found Clarence in a small, faded facility, tucked behind a Baptist church in Natchez. He was frail, yes, but awake. A nurse guided them in gently, whispering, "He's been expecting you." Henry stepped in first. Clarence turned, and for a moment, time folded. No tears, no exclamations, just a nod like a soldier finally seeing another who survived the same war. Clarence had been hidden for 55 years, transferred from prison to prison under aliases, released quietly with no record, and finally deposited into long-term care by a nonprofit that specialized in re-entry cases. He remembered fragments, beatings, electric lights, concrete meals. But what stayed with him most was not the cruelty. It was the silence that followed. How no one came. How even the walls forgot him. "I thought you were dead," Henry said, voice gravel and regret. Clarence blinked. "I was, just not buried yet." Stephen sat across from them, watching, absorbing, unraveling. He no longer cared if he had Henry's blood. He had his burden and his fight. When they returned to Atlanta, everything had changed. The protests outside Rockridge Bank had shifted from sporadic to sustained. Banners covered the marble walls, some praising the courage of Henry and Stephen, others denouncing the collapse of tradition. A community forum had been organized at the Carter Center. Black families, academics, clergy, business owners, all invited to debate a word the bank had never allowed in its walls: reparations. Stephen sat near the front row, Henry beside him. The atmosphere was electric. Some speakers demanded financial payouts. Others called for housing grants, college scholarships, or land redistribution. A woman from South Atlanta, voice trembling, recounted how her grandfather had applied for a loan in 1954 and was denied because his application lacked generational stability. That same house had later been sold to a white family for half the price. Then it was Stephen's turn to speak. He stood behind the mic, eyes scanning the crowd. "My name is Stephen Rockridge, and I no longer represent the institution as it exists, but I'm here to propose something I hope becomes its future." He paused. "We don't just need to apologize, we need to redistribute power, permanently." The room leaned in. "I'm proposing that Rockridge Bank be restructured into a dual trust institution, where 50% of board votes are granted to a new reparations equity fund, run by representatives from the communities the bank once excluded. That fund would manage a permanent stake in the bank's profits, with oversight on hiring, lending, and community reinvestment." Whispers swept the room like wind through dry leaves. Stephen wasn't done. "Additionally, I want to rename the institution. The new name should reflect the legacy of those who built it, not just those who branded it. I propose we rename it the Gaines Rockridge Foundation." Henry looked at him, stunned, not because of the name, but because Stephen had finally understood. Truth is not about possession, it's about recognition. The forum erupted. Some stood and clapped, others wept, a few walked out. The next morning, Stephen presented the proposal to the board. The room was cold, quiet. Gordon Braithwaite was already there, seated at the far end. Legally he had no vote, but influence had never needed one. Stephen laid out the plan, slide by slide. He explained the structure, the voting power, the profit shares, the legal pathways for rebranding. Evelyn listened, face unreadable. Cliff Wallace furrowed his brow. Alistair Dunn looked as if he were aging by the minute. When he finished, there was silence. Then Alistair spoke. "You want to dismantle the very thing that made us powerful." Stephen met his eyes. "No, I want to give it a soul." Evelyn leaned forward. "And what if the market doesn't forgive us?" Stephen replied, "Then maybe we don't deserve its forgiveness." Gordon stood, buttoning his suit slowly. "Let's vote." They did. 10 members, 1 by 1. 8 votes against, 2 abstentions, 0 in favor. Stephen folded his hands. "Then I resign." Gordon smiled faintly. "That won't be necessary." Alistair rose. "By majority rule, we move to remove Stephen D. Rockridge from the board entirely, effective immediately." A silence fell like a guillotine. Final. Brutal. Stephen nodded, eyes burning but steady. "Then I'll take this proposal to the public, to the people, and let them decide what legacy this bank deserves." He turned to leave, but not before dropping a file on the table. "One more thing. You denied Henry's paternity to protect your name, but in doing so, you admitted something worse." He looked directly at Gordon. "That you're willing to erase the truth, even if it costs you everything." As Stephen exited the room, his phone buzzed. A text from Jordan. It read, "We just unearthed the burial site behind the original Rockridge branch. Dozens of undocumented graves. Black workers. It's real. All of it. Who gets to write the final chapter? Power or truth?" The air outside Rockridge Bank had shifted. It no longer crackled with anger. It pulsed with anticipation. As word spread about the discovery behind the original branch, dozens of undocumented graves beneath the old brick foundation, Atlanta stood still. Some tried to deny it. Others tried to spin it. But truth once unearthed refused to return to silence. Stephen stood at the edge of the excavation site, the earth freshly turned. A group of forensic archaeologists moved slowly, carefully lifting soil as each skeletal imprint was revealed. Black bodies, unrecorded, unacknowledged. Laborers who had built the institution from beneath, buried both literally and legally. Jordan stood beside him, silent, shaken. "They weren't just workers," he murmured. "Some of them, they were children." Stephen closed his eyes, nausea rolling through him. "They poured their blood into these bricks, and we built offices over their bones." Behind him, reporters swarmed, taking photos. A few board members hovered in the distance, avoiding the cameras, unsure of how much longer they could remain untouched. The illusion of history had shattered, and the soil was screaming its testimony. Stephen stepped away and didn't return to the boardroom. Not for meetings, not for statements. He made one final act. He packed his office into 3 boxes and left behind his security badge on the desk. He walked through the lobby without fanfare, without press, without anyone calling his name, and for the first time he felt free, not of shame, but of pretense. Outside, Henry was waiting. He stood leaning against a bench, not in defiance, but in quiet endurance. His coat hung over his arm, the morning light brushing the lines of his face. When Stephen reached him, neither man spoke for a long moment. Then Henry said, "You did more than I ever expected." Stephen gave a half smile. It still wasn't enough. Henry nodded. "Not yet, but it's a start." They walked through the city together, past neighborhoods once redlined, now repainted in gentrified tones, past murals that spoke more honestly than city officials ever had, past places Henry remembered from youth, now sterilized into upscale cafes and condos. History, he realized, didn't vanish. It was renovated. Later that day, in a public ceremony outside the Carter Center, Henry was handed a certificate by the Georgia Historical Commission, officially recognizing him as a founding contributor to the economic development of Atlanta. It was ceremonial, symbolic. But for a man denied his own narrative for decades, it meant something more. Henry stepped up to the mic. "My name is Henry L. Gaines, and today I reclaim not just my name but my history. For too long this city buried the bones and voices of the people who built it, but we are still here. Our truth is not just memory, it is proof, and proof demands recognition." He paused. "And if they won't give it, we will take it." The crowd erupted, not in anger, but in affirmation. That evening, news outlets carried Henry's speech nationwide. College campuses streamed it in auditoriums. Community centers held forums discussing economic repair. Civil rights organizations, energized by the public reckoning, began pushing for new legislation requiring financial institutions to release their historical lending data for racial equity audits. And while the city debated restitution, redemption, and what came next, the board at Rockridge Bank floundered. Clients pulled accounts, protests continued. The interim CEO resigned after 3 days. Stockholders panicked. Some demanded the bank sell to a conglomerate. Others proposed dissolving it entirely and absorbing its assets elsewhere. Inside the boardroom, Evelyn Carr, usually composed, now sat with her hands folded tightly. She read aloud a message from the city council. Until a new leadership structure representing the harmed communities is established, Rockridge Bank will be ineligible for city contracts. The board fell silent. Legacy was no longer enough. Then the door opened, and with it the future. A young black woman stepped inside. Late 20s. Crisp navy suit. Natural curls pulled into a tight crown. She carried no briefcase, just a folder marked Restorative Financial Architecture. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said calmly. "My name is Nia Wallace. I'm a community wealth organizer from Vine City. I've read your reports, I've seen your damage, and I'm here to fix what your fathers broke." Evelyn blinked. "On whose authority?" Nia didn't hesitate. "On behalf of the Gaines Rockridge Fund. We've pooled investment from black-owned credit unions, equity partners, and reparative trusts. We now represent a 26% voting share in your institution, and we're prepared to acquire more." She placed the folder on the table. "Our conditions are clear: community board seats, equity reparations through housing funds, transparency in all lending, and a name that tells the truth." Alistair Dunn scoffed. "And what do you call this truth of yours?" Nia looked him dead in the eye. "Justice with interest." As the board murmured in disbelief, Henry entered the room behind Nia. She turned to him and smiled. "I'd like you to serve as chair emeritus if you're ready." Henry looked around the boardroom that once locked him out, and simply said, "Let's get to work." A man denied his place in history becomes its final author. The grand opening of the Gaines Rockridge Center for Economic Justice took place under a sky streaked with orange and gold, the kind of sky Henry used to stare at as a boy in Mississippi, wondering if freedom ever had a color. The center sat at the edge of Vine City, where Henry once walked past boarded-up buildings and whispered legacies. Now beneath its shimmering glass facade and engraved steel signage, a new chapter had taken root. One no charter could deny, one no injunction could erase. Families from every borough came. City officials stood side by side with local activists. Children who had only heard Henry's name in classrooms now recited his quotes on stage. On the building's front wall, etched permanently in granite, read the words, "Truth takes time, but it never forgets its name. Henry L. Gaines." The center would offer financial literacy programs, small business grants, homebuyer support, and reparation-backed lending tools Henry had once begged banks to provide. Now his name would authorize them. Inside the auditorium, a video played. Henry, seated in a modest chair just weeks before the center's completion, had recorded a message. His voice, weathered but proud, echoed across the hall. "Don't let them tell you justice is a theory. Make them see it in your paycheck, your mortgage, your children's schools. You can't eat apologies, but you can build futures." The applause that followed lasted 3 minutes. But Henry wasn't there to hear it. He had passed quietly in his sleep 2 nights before the ribbon cutting. No hospitals, no tubes, just a man, in his own bed at peace. The press framed it as poetic. Some said it was God's timing, but those who knew him understood. Henry didn't need to witness the unveiling. He had already written it. Stephen received the call while coordinating a housing initiative in Pittsburgh. After being removed from the board, he had poured himself into a new role, Director of Restorative Finance for the Southeastern Housing Trust. His job was simple but essential: ensure that public housing funds reached the hands of Black and brown families without exploitation. He had never worked harder. When he heard the news, he didn't cry. He walked to the mirror in his hotel room and stared at himself for a long time. Not as a Rockridge, not as a reformer, just as a man who finally understood the shape of his own shadow and how long it had blocked out the sun for others. He booked the first flight back to Atlanta. Henry's memorial service was held beneath the oldest oak tree at the Westview Cemetery, surrounded by descendants of those same laborers whose graves they'd uncovered. Clarence, though weakened, sat in the front row, his hand wrapped in a black handkerchief embroidered with the word brother. Stephen stepped forward to speak. He didn't read from paper. He spoke from memory. I used to wonder who I was. Wonder why I never quite belonged in the rooms where people cheered for me. I've had a lot of titles. None of them ever fit, but this one does. He placed his hand on Henry's casket. Son? The word cracked his voice, but he didn't stop. Henry L. Gaines taught me that silence is not neutrality, it's permission. He taught me that apologies are easy, change is not, and he showed me that even when history tries to erase you, truth rewrites in deeper ink. As the crowd dispersed, Stephen stayed behind, alone. He crouched at the grave, now marked with a temporary headstone awaiting the final etching. His hand hovered over the cool dirt. You were more father to me than anyone ever was. No test can change that. The wind whispered through the trees like a hymn. A few steps away, Clarence stood watching, arms folded, lips pressed tight. He walked slowly toward Stephen, his steps uneven but firm. When he reached him, he didn't speak. He simply handed Stephen an old photograph, one Stephen had never seen. It was of Eloise, Henry, and an infant in her arms. My mother told you to keep quiet, Clarence said, but she never told you to forget. Stephen stared at the photo, then back at the headstone. Thank you. Clarence nodded. Make it count. Stephen stood, prepared to walk away, but something made him pause. A small hand reached past his leg. A boy, maybe 7 or 8, stepped forward from behind a nearby tree. Brown skin, eyes wide, uncertain. He wore a school uniform and held a single daisy in his hand. He placed it gently on the grave. Stephen knelt. What's your name? The boy whispered, Elijah. Stephen tilted his head. Did you know Henry? The boy nodded. My mom said he's my great-granddad. She said he built a bank from bricks and pain. Stephen's chest tightened. The boy looked up. She said he made room for us. As Elijah walked away, Stephen unfolded a note tucked into the daisy's stem. Written in a child's messy handwriting were the words, One day I'm gonna finish what he started. If this story moved you, if Henry's fight for truth, Stephen's awakening, and Elijah's quiet promise sparked something in you, then don't let it end here. We bring real, powerful stories like this every week. Stories that history tried to hide. Stories that deserve to be heard. So if you believe in honoring untold truths, in facing uncomfortable legacies, and in building something better, subscribe to this channel. Like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and let's keep these conversations